The silver fork slipped from the dowager's hand and struck her plate with a sound so sharp that every guest at the long table turned to look. Elara froze beside the sideboard, a jug of water still in her grip, and she knew at once that something bad was about to happen to her. "You there," the dowager said, her voice cutting through the quiet dining hall. "The new girl, come here." Elara set the jug down carefully and stepped forward. Her hands were steady, though her heart was not. She had been warned about Lady Beatrice Ashcombe before she ever set foot in this house. The other maids spoke of her in low voices, the way people speak of a storm that has not yet arrived but is certain to come. "Yes, my lady," Elara said, keeping her eyes low, the way she had been taught. "I am told you can read," the dowager said, and a few of the guests laughed softly, as though this were already a joke. "Is that true, girl?" "Yes, my lady, a little." "A little." The dowager smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Then perhaps you can tell us all where the River Nile begins, since you are so clever for a maid." The table went silent. Down at the far end, a young man in a dark blue coat set down his glass and watched with quiet interest. This was Julian Ashcombe, the Duke, and though he had been half listening to a dull conversation about horses, something in the air had changed, and he found he wanted to hear the answer. Elara lifted her eyes for just a moment. She had grown up with books, once, in a house that no longer existed for her, in a life she rarely spoke of. She knew this answer the way she knew her own name. "The Nile begins in the highlands of eastern Africa, my lady," she said quietly. "Near the Great Lakes, it flows north, through many kingdoms, until it reaches the sea." There was a pause. One of the guests, an older gentleman with a red face, chuckled in surprise. Lady Constance Pemberton, seated near the Duke, raised an eyebrow and looked at the maid with new interest, though not a friendly one. The dowager's smile faded. "A lucky guess," she said sharply. "Servants who repeat things they have overheard are not clever. They are simply parrots." "Yes, my lady," Elara said, and stepped back toward the sideboard, though her cheeks burned. But Julian was still watching her. He had asked no question, yet he found himself thinking about the calm way she had answered, the steadiness in her voice even as the whole table turned against her. Most people, when cornered, either crumbled or grew loud. She had done neither. "Grandmother," he said at last, his voice light but firm, "perhaps we might return to supper. I am sure the girl has duties to attend to." The dowager's eyes narrowed at her grandson, but she said nothing more, only lifted her wineglass and looked away. The conversation slowly returned to horses and weather and the coming autumn ball, but Julian's attention kept drifting back to the sideboard, where the maid stood with her hands folded, her face composed, as though nothing at all had happened. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the candles had been put out one by one, Elara walked the long stone corridor toward the servants' stairs. Her feet were sore, and her mind was still turning over the dinner, replaying the dowager's voice, the laughter, the silence after her answer. She did not expect to see the Duke standing near the library door. "You gave a very good answer tonight," Julian said, stepping into the candlelight. Elara stopped, startled, and quickly lowered her eyes. "Your Grace, I did not mean to speak out of turn." "You didn't. My grandmother asked you a question and you answered it correctly. That is not speaking out of turn. That is simply being right." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "Where did you learn about the Nile?" he asked, his tone curious rather than testing. "My father taught me to read, Your Grace, a long time ago." Her voice grew quieter. Before things changed, Julian studied her for a moment. There was something careful in the way she spoke, as though every sentence had been chosen to reveal as little as possible. He had met many women who spoke a great deal and said nothing at all. This maid said very little and seemed to be hiding everything. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elara, Your Grace, Elara Whitfield." "Well, Elara Whitfield," he said. "I hope my grandmother did not upset you too greatly." "I am used to it, Your Grace," she said simply, and there was no self-pity in the words, only fact. Something about that honesty struck him more than any flattery could have. He nodded once, as though deciding something, and stepped aside to let her pass. "Good night, then." "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and hurried past him toward the stairs, her heart pounding in a way she could not fully explain. The next morning, the kitchen was already buzzing when Elara came down before dawn to begin her work. Mrs. Hensley, the head housekeeper, pulled her aside near the pantry, her face tight with worry. "I heard what happened at supper," Mrs. Hensley said in a low voice. "You must be careful, girl. The dowager does not forget when she feels a servant has embarrassed her." "I did not mean to embarrass her," Elara said. "She asked me a question. I only answered it. I know, but that will not matter to her. Mrs. Hensley glanced toward the doorway, then lowered her voice further. And I saw the way the Duke looked at you afterward. That is more dangerous than anything the Dowager might do. Alara felt a chill, despite the warm kitchen fire. The Duke does not know me, Mrs. Hensley. He was only being polite. Polite men do not linger by library doors past midnight, Mrs. Hensley said. And though her tone was not unkind, there was real worry in it. You are a good girl, Alara, and a hard worker. I would hate to see you lose your place over something you did not even seek. Alara thought of the Duke's face in the candlelight, the quiet curiosity in his voice when he asked about the Nile, the way he had not laughed at her the way the others had. She pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. She had learned, in the 2 years since her family's fortune collapsed and she had been forced into service, that hope was a luxury she could not afford. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to mistakes, and mistakes in a house like this one could mean the end of everything. I only want to do my work and keep my place, she told Mrs. Hensley, nothing more. But as the day went on, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the library door, and to the sound of the Duke's voice asking her name as though it truly mattered to him. By afternoon, word of the dinner had spread through the entire household, as such things always did. The younger maids whispered about it while folding linens, some admiring, some jealous, a few outright unkind. Alara kept her head down and her hands busy, scrubbing the long hallway floors until her knuckles ached, hoping that hard work might make the whispers fade faster. It did not. At the far end of the hallway, Lady Constance Pemberton stopped mid-stride when she saw Alara kneeling with her scrub brush. Constance had heard the story already, twice, from 2 different sources, and each telling had made her more irritated than the last. "So you are the maid who embarrassed the Dowager," Constance said, her voice cool. Alara sat back on her heels. "I did not mean to embarrass anyone, my lady. I only answered a question. How convenient, to be so clever," Constance said, studying her the way one might study an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. "Tell me, does the Duke often stop to speak with the maids?" Ilara's stomach tightened. "I would not know, my lady." "No," Constance said slowly. "I suppose you would not." She turned and walked on, her skirts sweeping the polished floor, but her eyes had not lost their sharpness, and Alara understood, with a sinking feeling, that she had made an enemy without ever trying to. That evening, as the sun dropped low over the gardens and the estate settled into its quiet evening rhythm, Alara carried a basket of fresh linens toward the east wing. She took the long way, past the garden path, because it was the only part of her day that felt like it belonged to her. She did not expect to find Julian there, standing near the rose hedges with his hands behind his back, looking as though he too had been searching for a few private minutes away from the house. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and there was something almost pleased in the way he said her name. "Your Grace." She dipped a small curtsy, the basket still balanced on her hip. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You aren't disturbing me. I was only thinking." He glanced toward the rows of roses, red and pale pink in the fading light. "Do you enjoy gardens?" The question caught her off guard. No one in this house had ever asked what she enjoyed. "I do, Your Grace. My mother kept roses, once." "Once," he repeated softly, catching the word the way she had used it earlier. A small door left half open onto a past she did not explain. He did not push. Instead, he simply nodded, as though he understood there was a story there he was not yet permitted to hear. "I should return to my work," Alara said, feeling suddenly exposed, as though she had said too much without meaning to. "Of course." He stepped back to let her pass, but as she walked by, he added, quietly, "You are not what I expected, Miss Whitfield." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, and hurried on toward the house, her heart beating fast, though whether from fear or something else entirely she could not say. Behind her, Julian remained among the roses a while longer, turning her words over in his mind. A mother who once kept roses. A father who once taught her to read. A life that had clearly once been very different from the one she now lived, scrubbing floors and carrying linens through a house that was not her own. He did not yet know her story, but he found, with some surprise, that he very much wanted to. High above, in a window that looked down over the garden, the Dowager stood watching the 2 figures part ways in the fading light. Her face was still, but her eyes were sharp and cold, and when she finally turned from the window, she was already thinking of ways to end whatever this was before it had truly begun. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to Alara's life, one she did not ask for and did not know how to stop. Julian found reasons to walk the same halls she cleaned, He asked the housekeeper questions about the household staff that had nothing to do with running the estate. And twice more that week he found her alone, once near the stables and once outside the small chapel at the edge of the grounds, and each time he lingered a little longer than the last. Ilara told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not fall for maids. It happened in stories told by the fire, not in real houses with real rules and real punishments for girls who forgot their place. But she could not stop the small flutter in her chest each time she heard his footsteps in the hall, could not stop herself from listening for his voice among the many voices of the house. Mrs. Hensley noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. "You are smiling again," the housekeeper said one morning, catching Ilara at the wash basin with a look on her face that had no business being there so early in the day. "I am not smiling," Ilara said, though she quickly pressed her lips together. "You are. And I have seen that smile before, on other girls in other houses. It never ends well." Mrs. Hensley's voice softened, losing its sharp edge. "I am not scolding you, child. I only want you safe. The Duke may mean well. Young men often do, in the beginning. But the world he lives in has rules that do not bend for maids, no matter how clever or how kind they are." "I know the rules, Mrs. Hensley," Ilara said quietly. "I have not forgotten them." "Then remember them a little harder," the housekeeper said, and returned to her work, though her eyes lingered on Ilara a moment longer, filled with a worry she did not know how to put into fewer words. That afternoon, Julian found an excuse to visit the library at the same hour Ilara was assigned to dust the shelves. He told himself it was only curiosity, only the natural interest a man feels towards someone unusual in a house full of the usual. But when he stepped through the door and saw her standing on a small stool, reaching for the top shelf, a book already open in her free hand as though she could not resist reading even a single line while she worked, he knew it was more than curiosity. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and she nearly dropped the book in surprise. "Your Grace, I did not hear you come in." She stepped down quickly, closing the book and setting it back in its place. "I was only checking the binding was not damaged." "You were reading it," he said, not unkindly, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "You do not need to hide that from me." She flushed, unsure how to respond. "It is not my place to read your books, Your Grace. It is my library. I decide what is and is not permitted in it, and I am telling you now that you are permitted to read anything you like." He walked closer, glancing at the title of the book she had set down. It was a volume of old poetry, well worn along the spine, clearly a favorite of someone in the house long before Ilara arrived. "Do you enjoy poetry?" "I do, Your Grace. There is a comfort in it. Words arranged carefully, meaning more than they seemed to say at first." She paused, catching herself. "Forgive me. I did not mean to speak so freely. Do not apologize for that. I would rather hear you speak freely than watch you shrink into silence the way you did at supper the other night." His voice grew quieter. "That was not right, what my grandmother did to you. I should have said something sooner." "You did say something, Your Grace. You ended it before it grew worse." "I could have ended it before it began." He studied her for a long moment. "Tell me something, Miss Whitfield. How does a girl who quotes poetry and knows the source of great rivers come to be a maid in my household?" The question landed heavier than he perhaps intended, and Ilara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old instinct to close the door on her past before anyone could look inside it too closely. "My family fell on hard times, Your Grace," she said carefully. "There is little more to tell." "There is always more to tell," he said gently, "but I will not press you, if you are not ready to share it." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she had not expected in his eyes. Not pity, which she had learned to hate more than cruelty, and not the idle curiosity of a bored nobleman looking for entertainment. What she saw looked more like patience, as though he were willing to wait as long as it took for her to trust him, without ever demanding that she hurry. It frightened her more than anything the Dowager had said at supper. "I should finish my work, Your Grace," she said, stepping back toward the shelves. "Of course." He did not move to stop her, though he watched her a moment longer before turning toward the door. "Ilara." She paused at the sound of her name spoken so plainly, without title, without distance. "Thank you," he said, "for not pretending to be less than you are. Most people in this house pretend constantly. It is exhausting to be surrounded by it." He left before she could think of a reply, and she stood alone among the tall shelves for a long moment, her hand pressed flat against the spine of the poetry book, her heart racing in a way she did not know how to calm. Word of these small meetings did not stay hidden for long. Servants talked, as servants always did, and within days, whispers had reached every corner of the house. including the one person Elara most feared they would reach. The Dowager summoned her to the small sitting room off the east corridor on a gray afternoon, and Elara knew, the moment she stepped through the door and saw the older woman's face, that this would not be a pleasant conversation. "Close the door," the Dowager said. Elara did as she was told, her hands folding in front of her, her chin lifted just enough to hide how afraid she was. "I understand my grandson has taken an interest in you," the Dowager said, her voice flat and cold. "The library, the gardens, the stables. Quite a busy young man, suddenly finding so many reasons to be wherever you happen to be working." "I have done nothing to encourage it, my lady," Elara said honestly. "Whether you encouraged it or not is beside the point." The Dowager rose from her chair and crossed the room slowly, her eyes never leaving Elara's face. "You are a maid, he is a duke. There is a wall between those two words, built over centuries, and it does not fall simply because a foolish young man finds a pretty face interesting for a season." Elara said nothing, though the word pretty stung more than she expected, as though even the compliment had been twisted into an insult. "I will tell you plainly," the Dowager continued, "whatever this is, whatever small flattery you have allowed yourself to enjoy, it will end. My grandson has a duty to this family, to this estate, and to a marriage that will secure both. Lady Constance Pemberton is the woman he will marry. Nothing you say or do will change that." "I have never wished to change anything, my lady," Elara said quietly. "I only wish to keep my position and do my work." "Then do it," the Dowager said sharply. "Stay out of the library. Stay away from the gardens when he walks there. If I hear that you have sought his attention even once more, you will find yourself without a position in this house, or any other I have influence over. Do you understand me?" "Yes, my lady." "Good. You may go." Elara left the room with her hands trembling, though she kept her face as still as she could manage until she was well away from the Dowager's sharp eyes. Only in the empty stairwell did she allow herself to lean against the cool stone wall and breathe, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she did not want to name. She had not sought the Duke's attention. She had not asked for any of this. And yet she understood, with a sinking certainty, that the Dowager would not believe that, and worse, that it might not matter whether it was true. That night, unable to sleep, Elara sat by the small window of the servants' quarters and looked out at the dark shape of the garden below, the roses invisible now in the moonless night. She thought of her mother, who had once kept roses of her own, in a house long since sold to pay her father's debts. She thought of the books that had once filled their shelves, sold one by one until nothing remained but memory. She had built a quiet, careful life for herself here, small and safe, asking for nothing more than to be left alone to work and survive. And now, without meaning to, she had drawn the attention of the one man in the house whose attention could unmake everything she had built. She did not know, sitting there in the dark, that Julian was awake as well, standing at his own window on the far side of the house, thinking of a girl who read poetry in secret and knew the source of great rivers, and wondering how he might see her again without bringing the wrath of his grandmother down upon her head. Neither of them yet understood how far this quiet, dangerous thing between them had already begun to grow, nor how much it would cost them both before it was finished. The warning from the Dowager should have been enough to end things. Elara told herself this every morning as she rose before dawn. Every evening as she fell into bed exhausted from work that seemed to grow heavier by the day. She avoided the library. She took the long way around the gardens. She kept her eyes down whenever she passed through the halls where the Duke might appear. It did not matter. The Dowager had decided that a warning was not enough. Within days, Elara found her duties changed without explanation. She was moved from the gentler work of the upper floors to the harshest tasks in the house, scrubbing the stone floors of the kitchen from before sunrise, hauling water and coal up 3 flights of stairs, mending linens late into the night by a single candle after every other task was finished. Mrs. Hensley protested quietly to the steward, but the orders had come from the Dowager herself, and no one in the house dared question her directly. "This is not fair," Mrs. Hensley said one evening, finding Elara on her knees in the kitchen, her hands raw and red from the cold water and the harsh soap. "You have done nothing wrong." "I know," Elara said simply, not looking up from her work. "But it does not matter what I have done. It only matters what she fears I might do." "And what is that?" Elara paused, wringing out her cloth. "Exist," she said quietly. "Be seen. Be spoken to as though I were a person and not a piece of furniture." Mrs. Hensley had no answer for that, and after a moment, she simply knelt beside her and began scrubbing the far end of the floor, saying nothing more, but staying until the work was done. Julian noticed the change immediately. He noticed Elara's absence from the library, the new shadows beneath her eyes when he caught brief glimpses of her carrying coal buckets across the courtyard, the way she flinched slightly when any of the senior staff raised their voice near her. He did not need anyone to explain what had happened. He understood at once that his grandmother had taken action, and that Alara was paying the price for his own careless interest. He confronted the Dowager in her private sitting room, closing the door firmly behind him. "You have moved Miss Whitfield to the harshest duties in the house," he said. "No attempt at pleasantries. I want to know why." The Dowager did not look up from her needlework. "She is a maid, Julian. Maids are assigned duties as the household requires. I do not see why this concerns you. You know precisely why it concerns me, and I would ask that you not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." She set down her needlework then, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "Very well. Since you insist on plain speech, I will give it to you. That girl has caught your interest, and you have been foolish enough to let it show in front of the entire household. I have taken steps to remind her of her place, because it is clear she needed reminding, and because you, apparently, needed a reminder as well. She has done nothing wrong. She has done everything wrong simply by existing in a way that distracts you from your true responsibilities. You are the duke of this estate. You have tenants who depend on you, a family name that must be protected, and a marriage to secure that will strengthen both. Lady Constance is refined, well-connected, and entirely appropriate. A maid, however clever, is not a future for you. She is a diversion, and a dangerous one." Julian's jaw tightened. "You do not know her. I do not need to know her. I know exactly what she is, and exactly what you are, and I know that the distance between those two things cannot be crossed without ruining everyone involved, including her." The Dowager's voice softened slightly, though her eyes remained hard. "I am not doing this to be cruel, Julian, whatever you may believe. I am doing this to protect this family, and yes, in my own way, to protect her as well. If this continues, if word spreads beyond these walls that the Duke has taken an interest in a maid, do you know what will happen to her? She will be dismissed without a reference. No respectable house will take her in afterward. She will lose everything, and you will move on to your marriage as though nothing happened at all, because that is what men in your position always do." The words struck harder than Julian expected, not because they were cruel, but because some small part of him feared they might be true. He had never truly considered what might happen to Alara if this went wrong, only what he himself wanted. It was, he realized with some shame, exactly the kind of carelessness his grandmother had accused him of. "I will not simply abandon her to protect my own comfort," he said finally, "but I will be more careful. For her sake, not for yours." "See that you are," the Dowager said, returning to her needlework as though the conversation were already forgotten. "Because I promise you, Julian, I will not hesitate to do whatever is necessary to end this before it costs this family everything it has built." Julian left the room with a heaviness in his chest he had not expected, torn between his growing feelings for a woman he barely knew, and his very real responsibility to the people who depended on him. He did not go looking for Alara that evening, though every instinct urged him to check that she was well, to apologize for the trouble his interest had caused her. He told himself it was restraint. It felt more like cowardice. Meanwhile, Lady Constance Pemberton had not been idle. She had heard enough whispers from her own maid, who heard them from other maids, who heard them from the stable hands, to understand that something was happening between the Duke and a servant girl, and the idea offended her deeply, though less from wounded feeling and more from wounded pride. She had spent 2 seasons being paraded before eligible men, always poised, always polished, always exactly what was expected of her, and she had no intention of losing the one match that finally seemed within reach to a maid who could recite geography lessons at supper. She found her cousin, Lord Percival Rourke, in the drawing room that evening, swirling a glass of wine with the bored expression he wore most of the time. "I need your help," Constance said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Percival raised an eyebrow. "With what, dear cousin? Your dressmaker again?" "With the Duke," she said, sitting across from him. "There is a maid in this house. Alara Whitfield. He has taken an unusual interest in her, and I intend to see that interest ended before it becomes a scandal that ruins my chances here." Percival's bored expression sharpened into something more calculating. He had his own reasons for wanting Constance's marriage to succeed, reasons that involved certain debts owed to him by her family that would be forgiven the moment she secured a wealthy match. "What do you propose?" "I do not know yet," Constance admitted, "but I know that girl has secrets. No maid speaks the way she does, knows the things she knows, unless she came from somewhere very different from where she is now. If we can find out what she is hiding, we may be able to use it. And if there is nothing to find? Constance's eyes narrowed. Then we will simply have to create a reason for her to disappear from this house entirely, one way or another. Percival smiled slowly, the expression of a man who enjoyed a challenge, particularly one that might benefit him regardless of how it ended. Then let us begin, cousin. I find I am suddenly quite interested in the history of Miss Alara Whitfield. Unaware of the plans being made against her in the drawing room above, Alara continued her harsh new duties late into the night, her body exhausted, but her mind unable to rest. She thought often of the library, of the quiet conversation about poetry and rivers, of the strange warmth she had felt when Julian said her name, without title or distance. She told herself, again and again, that it meant nothing, that it could mean nothing, that the wall the Dowager had described was real, and would not fall simply because two people wished it would. But late that night, as she finally climbed the narrow stairs toward her small room, exhausted beyond thought, she found a single folded note slipped beneath her door. She opened it with trembling hands, recognizing the elegant, careful handwriting at once. I am sorry for the trouble I have caused you. It was never my intention to make your life harder. If you wish me to stay away entirely, I will respect that, though it would grieve me greatly to do so. You deserve far better than the treatment you have received in this house, and I intend to see that it changes, whatever the cost to myself. Until then, please know that I have not forgotten our conversation about the poetry, or the roses, or the rivers. I think of it more than I probably should. J. Alara read the note 3 times before folding it carefully, and tucking it beneath the small stack of belongings she kept hidden beneath her bed, the only possessions she had carried with her from her old life. She did not know what to do with the warmth spreading through her chest, or the fear that came alongside it, twin feelings that refused to separate no matter how hard she tried to untangle them. She was, she realized, in far more danger than simple hard labor and cold water could ever cause her. She was in danger of hoping, and hope, in a house like this one, was the most dangerous thing of all. Percival Rourke was a patient man, when patience served his purposes, and nothing served his purposes quite like a secret waiting to be uncovered. He began his search quietly, first among the household staff, offering coins to loose tongues in exchange for anything they might know about the maid called Alara Whitfield. Most knew little. She had arrived nearly 2 years ago, recommended by a distant acquaintance of the housekeeper, and she had kept to herself ever since, speaking rarely of her past and never of her family. It was the silence itself that told Percival the most. Servants who came from poverty spoke of it freely, without shame, because poverty was common and nothing to hide. Servants who came from somewhere higher and had fallen spoke of their past reluctantly, guarding it the way one guards a wound still tender to the touch. Alara's silence had the shape of the second kind. He wrote letters. He had connections in London who owed him favors, men who could search old records of bankruptcy and ruin, families who had once held land and titles before losing everything to debt or scandal. It took the better part of 2 weeks, but eventually a reply arrived that made Percival smile in a way that boded ill for someone. He brought the letter to Constance in the privacy of her sitting room, setting it before her with the satisfaction of a man laying down a winning hand of cards. Whitfield, he said. Not a common name, and not one I expected to find any record of, until I widened my search to families who once held minor estates before losing them. There was a Sir Edmund Whitfield, a baronet of modest fortune, who lost everything 8 years ago, in a series of poor investments and worse debts. He had a wife, who died shortly after the ruin, and a daughter. Constance's eyes widened. A daughter. Named Alara, Percival said, tapping the letter. Sir Edmund himself died 3 years ago, leaving nothing behind but debts too large for any relative to absorb. The daughter simply vanished from the records after that. No marriage, no death listed, nothing. She would have been, by my estimate, exactly the age our little maid appears to be now. Constance sat back, a slow smile spreading across her face. So she is not merely clever. She is gentry, fallen into service. It would seem so. This is even better than I hoped, Constance said, standing and pacing the small room with new energy. If it were simply a matter of a maid catching the Duke's eye, that would be scandal enough. But a fallen gentlewoman, hiding her true identity, working her way into a Duke's affections under false pretenses, that is not simply scandal. That is deception. That could ruin her utterly, and utterly ruin any chance Julian might have of defending her once the truth comes out. How do you intend to use it? Constance considered this carefully. Not yet. Not until we are certain it will do the most damage. If we reveal it too soon, Julian may simply forgive her for hiding her past, may even feel sympathy for her circumstances. No, we must wait until the moment is right, until his feelings have grown deep enough that the revelation will feel like a betrayal rather than a sad story. Then we strike, and there will be no recovering from it. Percival raised his glass in a small toast to her cunning. You continue to impress me, cousin. I intend to be a duchess, Percival. I did not come this far to lose everything to a maid with a sad history and a talent for reciting rivers. Her smile turned cold. Let her enjoy whatever attention she is receiving now. It will make the fall so much sweeter when it comes. Unaware of the plans forming against her, Ilara had begun, cautiously, to allow herself small moments of hope. Julian had kept his distance publicly, exactly as he promised, careful never to seek her out where the Dowager or other watchful eyes might see. But he found other ways, quiet ways, to let her know he had not forgotten her. A book of poetry left on the small table near the servants' garden, with no note attached, though she knew immediately who had left it. A word passed through Mrs. Hensley, gently, that her harsh new duties were to be lightened, the order coming from the steward but everyone in the house understanding whose quiet influence had caused the change. They met only once more that fortnight, by accident rather than design, in the narrow corridor near the chapel where Ilara sometimes went in the early morning before her duties began, seeking a few minutes of quiet, before the noise of the house consumed her day. I did not expect to find you here, Julian said softly, stepping into the small chapel where she knelt near the front pew, her head bowed. Ilara rose quickly, startled but not afraid. Not anymore. Not of him. I come here sometimes. It is quiet. It reminds me of somewhere I used to know. Your old home? She hesitated, then nodded, surprising herself with how easily the admission came. My father's chapel was smaller than this, and far less grand, but the quiet was the same. I used to sit there for hours as a child, imagining stories about the saints painted on the windows. Tell me one, Julian said, sitting quietly in the pew beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. One of the stories you imagined. And so, hesitantly at first and then with growing ease, Ilara told him a small story from her childhood, about a saint she had invented herself, one who protected travelers lost in storms, guiding them home with a lantern that never went out no matter how hard the wind blew. Julian listened with complete attention, the kind of attention she had rarely received from anyone in her life, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I think, he said finally, that you have been carrying your own lantern through a very long storm, Miss Whitfield. And I think you have done it with more grace than most people could manage. Ilara felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, and she looked away, embarrassed by the sudden rush of feeling his words had stirred in her. You should not say such things to me, Your Grace. It only makes this harder. Makes what harder? Everything, she said quietly, remembering my place, remembering that whatever this is between us cannot become anything more, not without ruining everything I have left. Julian was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and certain, in a way that surprised her. I do not accept that it cannot become anything more. I do not yet know how, and I understand the danger, to you more than to me. But I am not a man who gives up easily on the things I believe are worth fighting for, and I have come to believe, Ilara, that you are worth fighting for. She did not know how to answer him, and before she could try, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside startled them both into silence. Julian rose quickly, putting proper distance between them, just as one of the upper maids passed the chapel door, glancing in briefly, before continuing on her way, apparently noticing nothing unusual. But Ilara's heart was pounding, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what he had said, words she would carry with her long after he had left the small chapel, words that planted a dangerous new seed of hope in a heart that had spent years learning not to hope for anything at all. She did not yet know that somewhere above her, in a quiet sitting room, two people were already plotting the exact moment they would use her hidden past to destroy whatever fragile thing was growing between her and the Duke, nor did she know how little time remained before that moment arrived. The autumn ball had been planned for months, a grand affair meant to formally announce, in all but name, the expected engagement between Julian and Lady Constance Pemberton. The Dowager had overseen every detail herself, from the arrangement of flowers to the seating of guests, determined that the evening would proceed exactly as she intended, with no room for surprises. Constance had chosen the ball as the moment to strike. She waited until the hall was full, until the musicians had finished their first set, and guests had scattered into small clusters of conversation, wine glasses in hand, laughter drifting up toward the high ceilings. She found the Dowager near the refreshment table and drew her aside with a look of practiced concern on her face. "My lady, I hesitate to trouble you with this, especially tonight of all nights," Constance began, her voice pitched low and careful. "But I feel it is my duty to share something I have learned, something that concerns the safety of this family's reputation." The Dowager's eyes sharpened immediately. "Speak plainly, Constance. I have no patience for riddles tonight." "It concerns the maid." "Elara Whitfield," scoffed. Constance paused for effect, watching the Dowager's expression carefully. "She is not who she claims to be. Explain yourself. She is not simply a maid of humble origin, as everyone in this house has assumed. She is the daughter of Sir Edmund Whitfield, a baronet whose fortune collapsed under a mountain of debt 8 years ago. Her father died 3 years past, leaving nothing but ruin behind him. She has been hiding this her entire time in your service, presenting herself as a common girl while secretly nursing ambitions above her station." The Dowager's face had gone very still, the kind of stillness that Constance had learned, over the course of the evening's planning, to recognize as far more dangerous than open anger. "You have proof of this?" "My cousin Percival has letters confirming every detail, records of the bankruptcy, the family name, the timing of the father's death. There is no question of it, my lady. She has deceived this entire household, and worse, she has deceived your grandson, allowing him to believe her merely a clever servant, when in truth she has been positioning herself, quite deliberately, to attract his attention and rise above the position fate assigned her." It was not entirely true, this last part, and Constance knew it was not true even as she said it, but she had learned long ago that a story only needed to sound true to do its damage, and this one sounded very true indeed. The Dowager was silent for a long moment, her mind working through the implications with the cold efficiency of a woman who had spent decades protecting her family's name from every threat imaginable. "Where is she now?" "Below stairs, my lady, attending to the evening service as usual, I would imagine." "Bring her to the small drawing room. Quietly. I do not wish this handled in front of the guests." Constance's smile was thin and satisfied as she went to arrange it, and within a quarter hour, Elara found herself summoned from her duties and led through the halls to the small drawing room, her stomach tight with a dread she could not name but felt instinctively, the way animals sense a storm long before the first clouds appear. The Dowager was waiting when she arrived, standing near the cold fireplace with her hands folded before her, and Percival stood nearby holding a folded letter that Elara did not yet recognize but somehow already feared. "Close the door," the Dowager said, and Elara did, her hands trembling slightly though she tried to steady them. "You wish to see me, my lady? I wish to give you the opportunity to explain yourself, before I decide what is to be done with you." The Dowager's voice was cold and controlled, more frightening than any shout could have been. "Tell me, Miss Whitfield, or should I say, Miss Elara of the House of Whitfield, baronets of modest but respectable standing until your father's ruin 8 years ago. Tell me why you have spent 2 years in my household, pretending to be nothing more than a common maid." The color drained from Elara's face. She had known, of course, that this moment might come eventually, had feared it every day since arriving at the estate, but hearing her father's name spoken aloud in that cold, accusing voice struck her like a physical blow. "I never pretended anything, my lady," she said, her voice unsteady but determined. "I simply did not speak of my past. There is a difference." "Is there?" Percival stepped forward, unfolding the letter with theatrical slowness. "You allowed everyone in this household, including the Duke himself, to believe you were simply a poor girl of no particular background. You never once mentioned that your father held a title, however briefly, before losing it to ruin. That is not silence, Miss Whitfield. That is deception." "I had my reasons for my silence," Elara said, her chin lifting despite the fear churning in her stomach. "My father's ruin brought nothing but shame and pity wherever it was known. I did not wish to carry that shame into a new position, into a house where I hoped to be judged by my work rather than my family's failures." "A sympathetic explanation," the Dowager said coldly, "but it changes nothing about the danger you represent. My grandson has taken an unfortunate interest in you, an interest that has only grown more serious, I am told, in recent weeks. Had he known you were the daughter of a ruined baronet rather than a girl of no family at all, do you think his interest might have grown even more dangerous? Do you think he might have convinced himself that some small nobility remained in your blood, enough to justify pursuing you further than propriety allows?" Elara said nothing, because she did not trust herself to speak without her voice breaking entirely. "I want you gone from this house by morning," the Dowager continued. "Without reference, without explanation to the staff beyond what I choose to give them. You will disappear from my grandson's life as thoroughly as though you had never arrived in it, and you will not contact him, not by letter, not by messenger, not in any way, for as long as you live. Do you understand me? My lady, please. Do you understand me? The Dowager repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Yes, Ilara whispered, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall in front of these people. I understand. She was dismissed with a wave of the Dowager's hand, and she left the small drawing room in a daze, her feet carrying her through the halls without any real sense of direction, her mind a storm of grief and fear, and the terrible, familiar feeling of having lost everything through no true fault of her own. She did not see Julian until she nearly walked into him near the servants' stairs, his face immediately shifting from surprise to concern when he saw the state she was in. Ilara, what has happened? I have to leave, she said, her voice breaking at last. Tonight, by morning. Your grandmother knows about my father, about the ruin, about everything, and she has ordered me gone before the sun rises. Julian's expression darkened. She cannot simply dismiss you without cause. She has cause enough, in her eyes. I hid my past. I allowed you to believe I was someone I am not. Ilara wiped hastily at her eyes. Perhaps she is right to send me away. I never should have allowed any of this to happen between us. It was foolish of me to hope for something that was never possible. Do not say that, Julian said firmly, stepping closer. None of this is your fault. You did nothing wrong by protecting yourself from shame that was never truly yours to carry. My grandmother is punishing you for surviving, and I will not allow it. Your Grace, please, you must not interfere further. It will only make things worse for both of us. I am done being careful, Julian said, and there was a new resolve in his voice, one Ilara had not heard before. I have spent weeks trying to protect you by keeping my distance, by letting my grandmother believe she controls this house entirely, and it has changed nothing, except to bring you more suffering. That ends tonight. Before Ilara could protest further, he turned and strode back toward the ballroom, leaving her standing alone in the corridor, torn between hope and terror at what he intended to do. He found his grandmother still in the small drawing room, Constance and Percival lingering nearby with expressions of poorly hidden satisfaction that made Julian's jaw tighten with barely controlled anger. I understand you have dismissed Miss Whitfield, he said, closing the door behind him with deliberate calm that did not match the fury building beneath it. I have, the Dowager said, unmoved, for excellent reasons, which I am happy to explain, though I suspect you already know them, given your evident distress. I know that you have punished a young woman for hiding a painful past that was never any business of yours or mine to demand from her. I know that you have used her father's ruin, a tragedy that was not her fault, as a weapon to remove her from this house, before I could decide for myself what I wanted to do about my feelings for her. Your feelings, the Dowager said sharply, are precisely the problem, Julian. You are the Duke of Ashcombe. You have responsibilities to this family, to this estate, and to a suitable marriage that will secure both for the next generation. Whatever affection you have developed for that girl is a luxury you cannot afford, no matter how gently you wish to phrase it. Then I will simply have to afford it anyway, Julian said, his voice steady despite the storm building within him. Because I have decided, grandmother, that I would rather risk your disapproval than live a life built entirely on obligation, with no room left for anything that actually makes it worth living. Constance, who had been listening with growing alarm, stepped forward. Julian, surely you cannot mean to throw away everything for a maid, however sympathetic her circumstances. Think of what people will say. I have spent my entire life thinking of what people will say, Julian replied, turning to face her directly. I am rather tired of it, Constance, and I think, if you were honest with yourself, you would admit that your concern here has far more to do with your own ambitions than with any genuine affection for me. Constance's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing, unable to argue against a truth she had never bothered to hide particularly well. I forbid this, the Dowager said, her voice rising for the first time that evening. I forbid you from pursuing this any further, Julian. I have spent my entire life protecting this family's name, and I will not stand by while you destroy it in a single foolish season over a servant girl with a sad story. You may forbid whatever you like, grandmother, Julian said quietly, but I am the Duke of this estate, not you. And the decision, in the end, is mine to make. Miss Whitfield will not be leaving this house tonight, or any night, unless it is by her own choice, and no one else's. He turned and left the room without waiting for her response, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had just declared, uncertain exactly how he intended to make good on his words, but certain, for the first time in weeks, that he was no longer willing to let fear and obligation dictate the shape of his life. Behind him, the Dowager stood very still, her face pale with a fury she had rarely felt in all her years running this household, already turning her mind toward what drastic measure might yet be taken to prevent the disaster she was certain was now unfolding before her very eyes. News of the confrontation in the drawing room spread through the household with astonishing speed, as such things always did in a house full of servants who had ears everywhere and loyalties divided in every direction. By the time Alara heard the full story, second-hand from a wide-eyed kitchen maid who had overheard it from a footman who had been standing near the door, she could hardly believe what she was told. The Duke had defied his grandmother, openly, in front of Lady Constance and Lord Percival both. She did not know whether to feel hope or dread, and so she felt both at once, a confusing tangle that kept her awake long after the rest of the servants' quarters had gone dark and silent. She did not have to wait long to learn what would happen next. The following morning, before the household had fully stirred, Julian sent word through Mrs. Hensley that Alara was not to leave the estate, that her position, whatever shape it might take going forward, was secure, and that he wished to speak with her privately as soon as her duties allowed. Alara received the message with trembling hands and a heart that refused to settle into any single feeling for more than a moment at a time. She found him in the library that afternoon, standing near the window with the autumn light falling across his face, and when he turned to see her enter, the relief in his expression was unmistakable. "You came," he said. "You sent for me, Your Grace. I did not think I had much choice," though even as she said it, she knew it was not entirely true. She could have refused. She could have packed her small bag and left before dawn as originally ordered, sparing them both whatever difficulty lay ahead. She had not done that, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it was because some stubborn, hopeful part of her had wanted to see him one more time, before whatever came next. "You always have a choice, Alara," Julian said gently. "I want you to understand that, whatever happens from here, I will not force anything upon you that you do not wish for yourself." "What did you tell your grandmother?" she asked, needing to understand the shape of the ground she now stood on before she could trust it beneath her feet. "I told her the truth, that I have feelings for you that I no longer intend to hide or apologize for, that I understand the difficulty this creates, for you especially, and that I intend to face that difficulty rather than run from it by sending you away." He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance from her, though his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I should have said this weeks ago, the very night at supper when she first tried to humiliate you. I was too cautious, too worried about consequences that, in the end, mattered far less to me than I believed they did. Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected softly. "Please, if we are to have any honest conversation at all, I would like you to use my name." "Julian," she said, and the sound of it in her own voice felt strange and significant, a small crossing of a line she had spent weeks telling herself she must never cross. "I do not know what you are asking of me. I am asking you to allow me to court you properly, Alara, not in secret, not in stolen moments in the library or the chapel, but openly, with whatever consequences that brings. I know it will not be simple. I know my grandmother will fight this with everything she has, and society will have a great deal to say about a duke courting a maid, even one who was born to better circumstances than her current position suggests. But I am done pretending that none of this matters to me. It matters more than anything else in my life right now." Tears rose in Alara's eyes despite her every effort to hold them back. "I have spent so long telling myself that hope was dangerous, that wanting anything beyond survival would only lead to more loss. I do not know how to simply set that aside because you have asked me to." "Then do not set it aside all at once," Julian said gently. "Only consider it. That is all I ask for now." Before she could answer, the library door opened without warning, and the Dowager stepped inside, her face set in hard, determined lines that made both of them straighten immediately. "I thought I might find you both here," she said coldly. "Good. It saves me the trouble of searching further. Grandmother, this is not the time. It is precisely the time, Julian, because I have decided that if you insist on this foolishness, then we shall settle the matter now, openly, rather than allowing it to fester in secret meetings and stolen glances." She turned her sharp gaze on Alara. "You claim to care for my grandson. Tell me, girl, if you truly cared for him, would you allow him to destroy his family's standing, his responsibilities, everything he has built his life to protect, simply to satisfy your own desire to rise above your station?" "I have never asked him to destroy anything," Alara said, finding a steadiness in her voice that surprised even herself. "I have asked him for nothing at all, my lady. Every step in this has been his choice, made freely, and I have spent weeks trying to discourage it, precisely because I understood the cost to him. And yet here you stand, in his library, allowing him to speak of courtship. Because I am done listening only to fear, Ilara said, and something in her tone made even the Dowager pause. I have lived by fear for 8 years, my lady. Fear of poverty, fear of shame, fear of hoping for anything beyond simple survival. It has kept me safe, in its way, but it has also kept me small, and I am tired of being small, simply because the world decided long ago that girls like me are not permitted to want more. The Dowager's expression flickered, something almost like surprise crossing her cold features before she mastered it again. Pretty words. But words do not change the reality of what will happen if this continues. Scandal. Rejection from every respectable house in the country. A duke who married beneath him will find doors closed to him that were once open, and those consequences will fall on you as much as on him, perhaps more. I understand the risk, my lady. I have understood it since the very first conversation we had in the library, when Julian asked about my mother's roses. Ilara took a breath, steadying herself. But I have also learned, watching you, watching this entire household built around rules of status and appearance, that a life spent protecting reputation above all else is not necessarily a happy one. I would rather risk scandal and find real happiness than spend my life safe and empty. For a long moment, no one spoke. The Dowager stared at Ilara with an expression that was difficult to read, something caught between anger and reluctant respect, and Julian watched his grandmother carefully, waiting to see which way the moment would break. You are either very brave or very foolish, the Dowager said finally. Perhaps both, my lady. A ghost of something almost like a smile touched the corner of the Dowager's mouth, gone so quickly Ilara almost believed she had imagined it. My own mother told me something similar, once, many years ago, before duty taught me to set such foolishness aside. She turned to Julian, her expression softening only slightly, though it was more warmth than either of them had seen from her in a very long time. I will not pretend to approve of this, Julian. The difficulties I described are real, and they will not simply vanish because you and this girl have decided to be brave. But I find, against my better judgment, that I am tired of fighting a battle I suspect I have already lost. Grandmother? I am saying, the Dowager said, straightening with the last remnants of her authority, that I will not stand in your way further, provided you handle this with the discretion and dignity this family requires. There will be no scandal born of carelessness, do you understand me? If you intend to pursue this girl, you will do so properly, with respect for the process such things require, and you will prepare her, and yourself, for the difficulties that lie ahead rather than pretending they do not exist. Julian's face broke into an expression of relief and disbelief, so genuine that Ilara felt her own eyes fill with tears once more. Thank you, grandmother. Do not thank me yet, the Dowager said, though there was less bite in it than usual. There is still Lady Constance and her cousin to deal with, and I suspect they will not accept this outcome quietly. She was right to suspect it. Within the hour, word had reached Constance that the Dowager had withdrawn her objection to the match, and the news struck her like a physical blow. She found Percival in the drawing room, already aware of the change, his expression grim. This cannot stand, Constance said, pacing furiously. We have worked too hard, waited too long, to lose everything now, because the old woman has grown suddenly sentimental. There may yet be another path, Percival said slowly. The Dowager has withdrawn her objection, but public opinion is not so easily managed. If word of this reaches London before the family is prepared to announce it properly, the scandal could still be severe enough to force the Duke's hand. You would have me spread rumors. I would have you protect your own future, cousin, by whatever means remain available to you. Percival's eyes were cold and calculating. A letter to the right person, mentioning a Duke's unusual attachment to a maid of questionable background, need not even be signed. It would spread quickly enough on its own. Constance considered this for a long moment, torn between the temptation of revenge and a growing awareness that further scheming, if discovered, could destroy her own reputation, as thoroughly as it might damage Julian's. In the end, cold calculation won out over spite. No, she said finally. If this becomes known as my doing, I will lose whatever standing remains to me in society, and I have no wish to spend the rest of my life explaining away a failed and vindictive scheme. Let them have their scandal, if scandal is what it becomes. I will simply ensure that I am not tied to it, and find my fortune elsewhere, with someone less complicated than a duke who has lost his senses over a servant. Percival was disappointed but did not argue further, recognizing the wisdom in his cousin's sudden caution, and within the week, Both Constance and her cousin had quietly departed the estate, their presence no longer required, and their schemes, for now, abandoned. In the weeks that followed, Julian courted Alara exactly as he had promised, openly and with careful respect for the difficulties involved. He introduced her formally to the small circle of family friends whose opinions mattered most, presenting her not as a maid elevated beyond her station, but as Miss Alara Whitfield, daughter of the late Sir Edmund Whitfield, a young woman of good family who had endured hardship with more grace and dignity than most of society could ever claim to possess. Not everyone accepted the match easily. There were whispers, certainly, and a few doors that remained closed despite the Duke's best efforts, but there were also those who admired the courage of it, who saw in Alara's quiet strength and Julian's open devotion something rare and worth celebrating, rather than condemning. The Dowager, true to her word, did not stand in their way further, though she remained, for the most part, as sharp and demanding as she had always been, testing Alara at every turn with questions and challenges that Alara had come to understand were, in their own strange way, a form of respect rather than cruelty. The old woman never fully softened, not in any way that announced itself loudly, but there were small moments, quiet acknowledgments, that suggested a grudging admiration had grown where scorn once lived. On a cold morning in early winter, in the same small chapel where Alara had once told Julian a story about a saint who guided lost travelers home with an unfailing lantern, the two of them stood before family and a small gathering of friends and spoke vows that neither of them had ever truly believed. In their most hopeful moments, they would be permitted to speak. Alara wore a simple gown, elegant but without excessive display, her mother's small string of pearls, saved through years of hardship, and finally recovered from where they had been hidden away, resting at her throat. Julian watched her walk the short aisle with an expression of such open joy that even the Dowager, seated in the front pew with her hands folded properly in her lap, found herself blinking back an unexpected wetness in her eyes. When the vows were spoken and the small gathering rose in celebration, Julian leaned close to Alara and murmured, so quietly only she could hear, "I told you that you were not what I expected, Miss Whitfield." "And now?" she asked, smiling despite the tears on her own cheeks. "Now," he said, "you are everything I did not know I was searching for." Outside the chapel, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, soft and quiet over the gardens where roses would bloom again in spring, and somewhere beyond the walls of the estate that had once tried so hard to keep them apart. A new life was beginning for both of them, built not on the rigid rules of status and appearance that had governed so much of their world, but on something far rarer and far more valuable, a courage that had refused, even in its most frightened moments, to let go of hope. The first months of marriage brought a kind of happiness Alara had almost forgotten was possible, though they did not come without their own quiet difficulties. Becoming a duchess was not simply a matter of a new title and a new wardrobe. It required learning an entirely different rhythm of life, one where she was no longer the person scrubbing floors before dawn but the person others now looked to for direction, for grace, for the steady presence a great household required of the woman at its head. She struggled, at first, to feel comfortable giving orders to servants who had so recently been her equals, women she had scrubbed floors beside, shared meals with in the cramped servants' hall, comforted during long nights of exhausting work. Mrs. Hensley, still head housekeeper, noticed her discomfort within the first week, and drew her aside with the same blunt honesty she had always offered. "You are allowed to lead this household, Your Grace," the older woman said, using the new title with a small private smile, as though she still could not quite believe how far the quiet, careful maid she had once worried over had come. "The staff do not resent you for it. If anything, they respect you more, knowing you understand exactly how hard their work truly is, because you have done it yourself. I do not wish to seem as though I have forgotten where I came from," Alara said. "You never could, even if you tried," Mrs. Hensley said warmly. "It is written into everything you do. That is precisely why you will be a better mistress of this house than most who are born to the role, and never once think to wonder what it costs the people who serve them." Slowly, Alara found her footing, learning to balance the formal demands of her new position with the quiet compassion that had always defined her, adjusting wages for the household staff, ensuring the kitchen maids were given proper rest, insisting that no one beneath this roof would ever again be treated the way she once had been on that first, terrible night at supper. The Dowager watched these changes with a critical eye that gradually, almost imperceptibly, softened into something like approval. She never became a warm woman, not in any way the household would have recognized, but she began seeking Alara out in quiet moments, offering advice on managing the estate's finances, on handling difficult tenants, on the thousand small details of running a great house that she alone, after decades of experience, truly understood. "You have a good mind for this," the Dowager told her one afternoon, the two of them reviewing household accounts together in the same small sitting room where Alara had once been threatened with dismissal. "I confess I did not expect that, when I first learned of my grandson's foolish attachment." "I am glad to have proven you at least partly wrong, my lady," Alara said, and was surprised to hear something that might almost have been a laugh escape the older woman. "Partly," the Dowager agreed. "I still maintain the affection itself was foolish, born of romantic notions rather than sound judgment. But I will admit, the outcome has proven rather better than I feared." She set down her pen and studied Alara for a long moment. "You may call me Beatrice when we are alone. I find I have grown tired of the distance between us, now that it no longer serves any purpose." It was, Alara understood, as close to an apology and an acceptance as the Dowager was ever likely to offer, and she accepted it with the same quiet grace she had carried through every difficulty that had come before. Julian, for his part, found his own life transformed, in ways he had not fully anticipated. He had expected happiness, certainly, but he had not expected the particular steadiness that came from sharing his days with someone who understood both the burdens of his position and the value of the simple pleasures he had nearly forgotten to enjoy. Alara reminded him to walk in the gardens for no purpose beyond enjoying them. She read poetry aloud to him on quiet evenings, her voice filling the library with a warmth it had never held before. She asked after the tenant families by name, remembered their children's ages and their small troubles, insisted that the estate's wealth be used not merely to maintain appearances, but to genuinely improve the lives of the people who depended on it. Under their combined leadership, the estate began to change in small but meaningful ways. Wages improved. A small school was established for the children of tenant families, something Alara had quietly proposed after remembering her own father's insistence on education, even in the leanest years before his ruin. The harsh, rigid distance between the family and their servants softened, not entirely, for some traditions could not simply be erased, but enough that the household felt, for the first time in years, like a place built on more than obligation and fear. Word of the unusual Duchess spread slowly through society, first as scandal, then, as the months passed and no disaster followed, as something closer to fascination. Invitations that had once been withheld began to arrive again. Families who had initially refused to receive them found themselves curious enough to attend gatherings where the Duke and his once-maid wife were present, and most left those gatherings surprised to find her every bit as graceful, as intelligent, and as genuinely kind as the rumors, in their better moments, suggested. Not everyone came around. There remained those who never fully accepted a duchess who had once scrubbed floors, who spoke of her behind closed doors with the same cruel condescension the Dowager herself had once shown at that first fateful supper. But Alara had learned, through years of hardship and months of quiet courage, that she did not need every door to open in order to build a good and full life. She needed only the people who mattered, and those people, she found, were more numerous and more loyal than she had ever dared hope. A year after their wedding, on a warm afternoon in early summer, Alara found herself once again in the rose garden where Julian had first asked if she enjoyed gardens, so many months and so many trials ago. The roses were in full bloom, red and pale pink exactly as they had been that evening, and she stood among them for a long while, remembering her mother, remembering the girl she had been before ruin took everything from her, remembering the frightened maid who had once believed hope itself was too dangerous to risk. Julian found her there, as he so often did, drawn by some instinct to the same quiet corner of the garden whenever a spare hour presented itself. "You are thinking of something," he said, settling beside her on the small stone bench. "I am thinking of how far we have come," she said, leaning into him. "From that terrible supper to this, I could not have imagined it, even in my most hopeful moments." "Nor could I," Julian admitted, "though I suspect, if I am honest, some part of me knew that first night at supper, that you were going to change everything, whether I was prepared for it or not." "Was that fascination or fear?" she teased gently. "Both," he said, laughing softly. "It has always been both, from that very first evening, and I have never once regretted it." She rested her head against his shoulder, watching the late afternoon sun spread gold light across the rows of roses, and thought, not for the first time, that whatever hardships had brought her to this place, whatever cruelty and scheming had tried and failed to keep her from it, she had finally found the thing she had stopped believing she deserved: a home, a family, and a love that had not asked her to hide who she truly was, but had instead, from that very first night, been fascinated by exactly that. The garden held its quiet, and the roses continued their slow bloom into summer, and somewhere in the great house behind them, the Dowager watched from her window, as she so often did, a small, rare smile touching her face, as she observed the two figures seated together among the flowers, no longer a duke and a maid divided by an impossible wall, but simply two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly where they belonged.